Hello, everyone. Rachel Weaver here. I'm on faculty and staff at Lighthouse Writers Workshop. I have been putting together a series of videos called The Story of a Book, in which I ask debut authors, not always debut authors, but often debut authors, to tell us the story of how their book came to be. So today we have Johanna Garton with us. Thank you for being here today. I appreciate your time.
You are welcome. Happy to be here.
Johanna is the author of a creative nonfiction book called Edge of the Map. It just came out April 1st. Congratulations. Huge accomplishment.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I am going to turn it over to you at this point and let you tell us a little bit about how this book came to be in the world.
Okay, great. Rachel, thank you so much. So I'm very happy to be here and tell you a little bit about Edge of the Map, which has been my life and my passion for many, many years. And I'm so happy that it's finally landing in the hands of readers now. So Edge of the Map is an adventure story, very similar to Into Thin Air, for those of you who've read a lot of Jon Krakauer. It's based on the life of a high-altitude mountaineer named Christine Boskoff, who climbed from mid-90s through about 2006. She and her climbing partner, Charlie Fowler, who was a rock climber from Telluride, died in an avalanche in Western China in 2006. And so the story is really Chris's story and how she came about the sport of mountaineering, but it also really talks a lot about Charlie's life and their life together and this tragic ending that they had, which involved quite a bit of mystery and suspense. So the short story on Chris is that she was born in Wisconsin, raised in Wisconsin, not at altitude in any way at all. She was trained as an aerospace engineer and worked at Lockheed in Atlanta for several years, and then fell in love with the sport of mountaineering. She and her husband, Keith Boskoff, bought Mountain Madness, which was the adventure guiding company that had been owned by Scott Fisher. And many of you may remember his name because he died on the disaster in Everest in 1996. And that incident sparked the book Into Thin Air. So Chris and her husband bought Mountain Madness, and she moved to Seattle, and she began this just unbelievable career as a high altitude mountaineer. And she went on to become the only American woman to climb 6 of the world's 8,000 meter peaks. So she set that record in the year 2000, and actually no other American woman has surpassed her. So 20 years later, she still holds that record, which is really quite incredible. And she is right up there then with Ed Viesturs, who is the American male who climbed all 14, I believe, of the 8,000 meter peaks. So because she was very humble, most people don't know her name. And also because she was a woman in this sport very dominated by men, most people didn't know her name then. And even now they didn't know her name. They don't know her name. So I kind of have an interesting story as to how I came to the story. And maybe I can talk a little bit about that. What do you think,
please.
Rachel?
Yes, please.
Okay. So Chris and her climbing partner, Charlie Fowler, as I mentioned, they went climbing in Western Sichuan province in late 2006. And they had started to climb unclimbed peaks. And so they were very much off the grid. They hadn't left prolific details about where they were going. And so when they did not return on their flight back to the United States, their friends and family knew something was wrong. And that sort of sparked this international search and rescue to find them. And ultimately they were found. It took about 6 weeks to kind of track down where they went. And it was full of all this drama involving American search teams and search teams that were based in Telluride, which is where they lived at the time, as well as search teams in Seattle, which is where the company was based, along with Chinese search teams. And their bodies were eventually found. They had been killed in an avalanche in Western China. So at the time, I was not a mountaineer, but at the time I was living in Denver. This was back in 2006. And Chris and I were from the same hometown. She was 3 years older than me, and we went to the same high school, but we had never met. And because I wasn't a mountaineer, I didn't know about her rise in the sport. And also because she was so humble, she wasn't in the media very much. So when she went missing, my mother read this very small article in the local newspaper and called me and said, "Joanna, have you heard of this woman? She's from Appleton and she went missing, and I had no idea who she was. And both my mom and I became very intrigued with Chris and her story, which was just unbelievable for anyone really, but especially for a woman in a sport like this, high altitude mountaineering, that's really dominated by men. So my mother, who's also a journalist, began work on this book because she felt that the story needed to be told. And she became friends with Christine's mom, who at that time was 80 years old. And my mom worked tirelessly on the book for about 10 years until she was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And at that point, I had just published my first book and was looking for a second project. And so at that point, it made sense for me to offer to help my mom finish the book. So that was about 3 years ago, and I dived in, and I'm happy to have finished that work that she started so many years ago.
That is an amazing story. The fact that your mom started it and then you continued from there, that's an amazing story. I also, the other thing that strikes me as I listen to you speak is I find it really inspiring that Chris came to this love a little bit later in her life, right? And then fully embraced it and followed that passion, even though it hadn't been, it hadn't been in her from the very beginning, I think that's a really neat aspect of this story. The question I'm wondering is how did you go about, so you had all of this material that your mom had gathered, and then from there, were you still seeking to find out more information, or was it more a matter of organizing the information that you already had to create the book? So my question, I think, is around what was left to do? Like what sort of crafting challenges did you come across as you were working with this sort of handed over project?
Right, that's a great question. So a couple of different things. My mother had really envisioned this book as a biography, and I wanted it to be so much more than a biography. I saw all these like really juicy places to get lost because the sport of mountaineering is so fascinating and the personalities are so interesting, and there's so much drama, and there are issues around grief because it's a sport where there's quite a bit of death, or there can be a lot of death. There's the issue around the degradation of the mountains and the issues around the Sherpa community and how they are treated. There were all these really interesting issues, obviously related to women leading in fields that are dominated by men, not just in her sport, but in her profession as the only woman owner of a guiding company at that point. So I wanted it to be more than a biography. So I took my mom's research and saw where she was going, and then I kind of filled in the blanks and decided where I wanted to go, which was hard because I was completing something that she had started. So ultimately it had to involve a lot of conversation back and forth, and she ended up being very supportive and very happy, but it was definitely tricky to kind of go my own direction.
And then how did you navigate one thing that always interests me about creative nonfiction, in which you're writing about someone else's life, is how did you navigate did you show it to her loved ones that are still around? Did you reach out? Did you how did you navigate this idea of, or the presentation of someone else's life story in your words for those that were close to her?
Yes. So that is a big responsibility, I think, for any of us who are writing about the life of another person, a person who's passed on. You're really creating a legacy. So some people choose to do this in a vacuum. Some writers choose to have an image and kind of put that image together and create the book that they want. But I am really a journalist first and foremost. So I ended up talking to as many loved ones and friends and family members as I could. I talked to probably 75 or 100 different people the course of my research. Yeah, including all living people to the really monumental experiences in her life that I could still find. And it was definitely hard because there were a couple of scenes in the book that I wanted to include for which there were no living individuals. So in those situations, I had to really rely on newspaper articles and interviews that she had done describing those moments, as well as journals. I had access to her journals, so some of that was captured in her journals. And then oftentimes I would run those scenes past people who knew them well, people who knew her, other people in those scenes, to make sure that those felt authentic, because I definitely wanted to make sure that I was honoring all of those memories the right way.
Mm-hmm. And then can you talk a little bit about your journey towards publication? How did you shop the book? Did you shop the book around? How did you go about finding a place for this, either with an agent or a publishing house? Did you go through an agent?
No, I didn't go through an agent. And so that, I think, was, I don't know if I would call it unique, maybe partially luck, possibly. When I started talking to people, I spent a lot of time talking to people in Seattle, because that was where she had lived for so long and where the company was based. And I very quickly became connected, because that community is so small, the mountaineering community out in Seattle. I very quickly became connected with Mountaineers Books, which is a nonprofit kind of medium-sized publisher out of Seattle. And because there is no book at all really based on the life of a female American high altitude mountaineer, they were very interested in the book. And so it was a pretty easy sell for me. And so that's how it worked. I went directly to them and worked directly with them. So still to this day, I don't have an agent.
Yeah. One thing I have been finding, as I have been talking to a lot of people about how their books came to be in the world, is that it seems fairly split. A lot of people do go the route of an agent, but a lot of other people do go the route of contacting publishing houses directly that are open to it. And a lot of times that works, a lot of times that works even better, or just differently. It kind of depends on the type of book you've written, I think. And it sounds like you were very clear on who would appreciate and love the book as a publisher. And so that does seem like a really good fit.
Yes, I think so. Yes, I love that you found that it's split. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm so glad, because I think people can get very nervous when they don't have an agent. And I'm here to say you definitely don't need an agent to sell your book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. And congratulations on the book coming out so recently.
Thank you.